I guess we can begin. I'm looking at the numbers. I'm very, very grateful for the turnout, and I'm very pleased that you could join us. Thank you all for making the time. So I want to begin by saying that this is an industry-driven webinar, and our goal is to clarify certain concepts and also to facilitate knowledge sharing within the industry, because we believe it's important. So we aim to ensure that stakeholders are well prepared to handle sectional title transactions. That's number one, and right from when we are conceptualizing these transactions and preparing a strategic roadmap for these projects. So please indulge me. I know we normally say that the first rule in real estate is location, location, location. But for purposes of this webinar, let me say that the rule is connection, connection, connection. Please make sure that your Wi-Fi is stable where you are so that you don't miss anything. And where you're sitting, please try and get 1% more comfortable, because I believe the information that we're about to share here might keep you glued. Now, before we begin, let me just go over a few housekeeping rules. So number one, if you have any questions during the session, please post them in the chat box. If time permits, we will address all the questions during the Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. And number two, we aim to keep this session within the scheduled time. So we will move through the content as quickly as possible. Now, let me introduce myself and tell you a bit about the firm. For those who don't know me, I am Lydia Owor, a partner at the firm, and I lead the real estate practice in the Nairobi office. About the firm, we are a law firm with a regional affiliation operating under a unified brand known as CDH, which stands for Cliff Decker Hofmeyr. I think so many people ask me how to pronounce the last name. So CDH means Cliff Decker Hofmeyr, and Kieti Law LLP is the Nairobi office. So what it means to have a regional footprint is that you will be working with a law firm that, how can I put it, that has already adapted to the markets where we are. And therefore, you will be working with a broader pool of talent and expertise within the law firm. And then it also means that your cross-border transactions will be handled seamlessly across multiple jurisdictions. And I would also say that it means that if our credibility is good enough to sustain such a collaboration, then you can be assured by the quality of work and the reputation associated with it. Right? I believe so. So I am joined by Mr. David Ochieng, who is a government surveyor with a wealth of knowledge in land surveying and sectional title plans. David will help us see around some of the problems that we encounter from a practical perspective, because he's the one with the technical expertise in relation to survey and sectional title plans. Now, in terms of the outline, the webinar is structured in two parts. So in the first part, I will make a presentation covering the key concepts which we picked for discussion today. And then following that, we will shift to an interactive segment where David, the government surveyor, will provide expert insights by answering 5 questions. And these 5 questions will be tackling the technical aspects of sectional titles. And then after that, we will move to the Q&A segment. Now, in terms of the preamble, what I want to say is that the key idea behind sectional titles is the ability to divide property into independent sections. And these independent sections can be owned separately, even if they form part of a larger development. And again, while maintaining the common ownership of shared areas. Think of a flat. So each flat would be each apartment within a flat would be an independent section. And then, when you look at the ground, we have the lifts, we have the hallways, those are the common areas. And then there would be the element of shared ownership, right? So the rise of sectional titles is more closely linked to urbanization or population growth. And because of this, there was a need to manage our cities efficiently, or the spaces within our cities efficiently. But then again, I found very interesting information when I was doing some research on this topic a while ago. I think I found an author who linked World War II, which is very interesting. He linked World War II to the rise of sectional titles. And his argument was that after World War II, many people were too traumatized to live in standalone houses. And because of this trauma, they preferred to live in condominiums instead of standalone houses, because it gave them a sense of community and a sense of safety, living with people around you. So I found that interesting. Maybe you can do a bit more research if you like history. Then again, historically, sectional titles were initially applied to enable vertical subdivision. Yeah. So by vertical subdivision, again, think a flat or an apartment block, or think airspace. So they were initially applied to enable subdivision of units on a vertical scale, but this concept was appreciated and it was quickly applied to horizontal subdivisions, especially where in cases of master planned estates. So the concept was applied even historically to this scale. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that there's a general misconception that the concept of sectional titles is new in Kenya. That's after 2020, the 2020 Act. This is very misguided because originally, sectional titles were originally introduced in Kenya through the Sectional Properties Act 1987. And it is this act that was then later repealed in 2020 and repealed and replaced with the Sectional Properties Act 2020. And the changes were not too many. There were changes, but there were not too many, if you ask me. And I wish I could take you through, some of the differentiators between the SPA, the Sectional Properties Act 1987, and the Sectional Properties Act 2020, but that would make the webinar too broad. So you will hear me refer to the two acts as the 1987 Act and the 2020 Act. So, don't get confused when you hear me, referring to the acts like that. So before I proceed, because, in the next slide, we are discussing the concepts, I need to, first of all, give an overview of what predominantly applied before the 2020 Act. And I'm saying predominantly applied, right? So previously we had about 5 land regimes before these land acts were repealed in the year 2020. But to illustrate the point that I'm about to make, I just want to focus on one of those land regimes, which is commonly referred to as the RTA. So the structure here worked like this. The seller or the developer would have one title, which we would normally call the parent title or the mother title. So they would have one title for the project land, and then the developer would issue long-term leases to the buyers, say a long-term lease for 99 years, with an assurance that the lease would be renewed on expiry. Although once in a while we encountered instances where we received lease agreements providing that upon expiry of the lease, then the buyer would yield up, which I disagree with, and we would fight a lot about this. So back to the point. So that is how the structure worked. You get a long-term lease with the assurance that the lease will be extended upon expiry. And number two, there would also be an undertaking by the developer that they would transfer the reversionary interest. And how we would structure it is that the reversionary interest would be transferred upon registration of the last lease agreement in relation to that development. And this transfer would be to the management company, right? And the management company under this regime, which I like referring to as the long-term lease regime, would be incorporated under the Companies Act. Now, I've mentioned the reversionary interest, and I think I need to clarify what that is so that we're all on the same page, right? So in property law, the reversionary interest refers to, I'm trying to see how I can explain it, but the reversionary interest refers to the right that a lessor, or let me say a landlord, has to regain ownership of the property after expiration of that lease, or maybe even after a set period. So it depends on what parties agreed to. This means that ownership rights in relation to that property, now in this case, the parent title or the mother title, would revert back to the lessor or the landlord. Now, still giving context about what predominantly applied. And then again, all the unit owners would be allocated shares in that management company, which has been incorporated under the Companies Act. And those shares in the management company would constitute an inseparable part of the lease. So that's why you would see in that long-term lease regime, whenever we were doing a transfer of lease, it also necessitated a transfer of shares, because they always, it had to be part of that lease, the share in the management company. And then that lease agreement would essentially be the constitution of that development. And what I mean by that is that the lease agreement itself would have, all the terms, conditions, covenants, rights, restrictions relating to the use and occupation of the unit in question, the common areas, and your obligations as a buyer, right? So now we have the Sectional Properties Act, which is providing a framework for the division of a building, right, into units. So, I keep on referring back to the example of an apartment block. So we now have the Sectional Properties Act, and sorry if I keep looking outside because I'm looking right in front of me. There's an example of that. So it provides for the division of buildings into units to be owned by individual proprietors. And then there would be the common property, which would be owned by those proprietors of the units as tenants in common. And I think I will elaborate more clearly what that means. And then number 3, the Sectional Properties Act also provides for the use and management of that common property. Okay. So now let us look at the key concepts. Here we are trying to understand the terminology that applies, because I believe that we need to begin by understanding the key terms so that, we are all on the same page. Now, the first one is a building, right? And a building is defined to mean one or more structures on the same parcel of land. Now, those structures can be built either vertically, meaning that there's one unit on top of another, and horizontally, which means that the units are side by side. Now, for context regarding the latter, where the units are side by side horizontally, please consider a compound in one of the leafy suburbs, which has the main house, and then it also has a guest house, maybe a 2-bed, and then it also has servant quarters. Such would be considered a building in the sense of that definition, and it can be designated a sectional, a sectional title. development. Okay, so I think I need to mention just on this point that there was previously a debate, especially when we were in conversation about the 2020 Act. There was a debate whether the 2020 Act actually applies to units on a horizontal scale, but I feel like that debate has since been settled because in practice now there are so many developments on a horizontal scale which have been processed under the 2020 Act. Now, the next terminology is the unit or the sectional unit. And what I need to highlight here is that the sectional unit rights extend from the external area of the unit to from the internal area of the unit. So using, again, the example of an apartment to the external area of that development. And please, just to be clear, I'm talking about the unit rights, right? Now, regarding tenancy in common and common property, what I need to elaborate very clearly is that sectional title ownership is three-pronged. That has to be understood. And what I mean by three-pronged is that sectional titles consist of three distinct components. So number one, it consists of full ownership of a unit. So again, take your mind to the apartment block. Let's call it apartment A. There's full ownership of that apartment. And then the second component is that there's shared ownership of the common property, which I've also described. Now, where in that setting, the unit owners collectively own the common property as tenants in common. And let me just clarify so that we're on the same page. When I'm talking about a tenancy in common, how we understand it is that it's a legal arrangement that allows two or more people to own distinct and divided shares in property. So two people owning distinct undivided shares in property, right? And another key element of tenancy in common is that there's no right of survivorship. And what I mean by the right of survivorship is that these are circumstances where two or more people own an equal interest in property, and then when in equal shares, mostly, and then when one of them dies, their interest passes automatically to the surviving joint tenant or tenants if it's more than one. And what common property is, for purposes of this conversation, I would like to simply define it as every part of the project land or every part of the parent title which is not connected to the units or the sections. Just remember, every time I'm talking about the section or the unit, I'm referring to, in this example, a singular apartment within an apartment block, within the example that I'm giving, because we have a different arrangement on a horizontal scale. Okay, so the next key term I wanted to highlight is the sectional plan. But I think I will leave this to the expert surveyor, that's David, to discuss, because during his segment, he'll be covering sectional plans. However, I just wanted to point out that one of the key differentiators between the 2020 Act and the 1987 Act is the requirement that every plan submitted for registration of a sectional plan has to be georeferenced. And then again, to understand what georeferencing is, I want you to imagine that you have constructed multi-units. And then after everything is finished, someone needs to officially place them on the big map of the country. And the reason for that is for us to be able to know exactly where those units are. So that process, the process of doing that, is what is called georeferencing. And I know there's a more learned way to describe what georeferencing is, but as I said, I would be out of depth, so let me leave that to the surveyor. So next, I will discuss the corporation. And I want to immediately emphasize that the corporation is not a company incorporated under the Companies Act. This body corporate is not incorporated under the provisions of the Company Act, because we still get situations where people have not transitioned mentally from that old system the system that predominantly applied, and what applies under the provisions of the Sectional Properties Act. So to emphasize again, the corporation, that body corporate, is not incorporated under the provisions of the Companies Act. It is constituted under Section 17 of the Act. And as I told you, the acts are largely similar. So if you look at the 1987 Act, you would find provisions in relation to the corporation under Section 17. And then in the 2020 Act, which repealed the 1987 Act, you will still find provisions relating to how the corporation is constituted under Section 17 of the Act. So again, I need to emphasize that sectional title unit owners do not receive share certificates in the same way that you would receive a share certificate in the management company structure. You don't do that. And maybe just for purposes of practice, because I know I have professional colleagues here, we still see instances where we receive sale agreements and buyers are being billed for acquisition of shares in the corporation. You really need to look at what the law provides, because you ideally do not receive shares in the corporation in the same way as we used to do in the management company system. What else do I want to highlight? Yeah, and I just wanted to say that because of that, it's actually very, very frustrating when you receive draft agreements with, a whole list of requirements for buyers under the corporation, which seem to relate to, what the obligations would apply if we were operating within a management company structure. And it's frustrating because you receive these agreements and the first thing you have to do is to, do the lesson, as I like to say it. And often you find that this is not taken too kindly. So what I would propose then is just, we just endeavor to understand these concepts for a better engagement in the industry. Now, this next slide is quite padded. I acknowledge that, but I guess it's information that we found very useful, and therefore it was difficult to condense. Here we are talking about exemptions and exclusions. So let's unpack what we are seeing on the slide. Number one, we have the 2021 regulations to the 2020 Act. And these regulations provide for exemptions in these three categories of leases. I've listed them here. This is what I refer to as the exemptions. And you know, at your own time, you can look through what the exemptions are. But as you can see, they include where a situation where the reversionary interest is expressly retained by the developer or the lessor, or in this case, a landlord, or the management company as the legal owner, right? Now, for us to understand what that means, when a registered owner sells property by way of granting a long-term lease, but retains ownership of the reversionary interest, it means that they retain the ultimate ownership of that property. And this is because after the lease term expires, the property will revert back to the registered owner unless that lease is renewed. So my view is that the seller has to expressly state in the underlying contract, which is basically, the agreement, that the sale does not include the reversionary interest. That has to be expressly stated. Otherwise, I would imagine that you run the risk of being cited for misrepresentation, especially if that underlying contract is marked as an agreement for sale rather than an agreement to lease, especially when the intention is not to confer ownership. So in my view, again, the intention to confer ownership and permanent transfer of rights is essential. When you're talking about an agreement to sale, you're meaning that you're selling. And in my view, the intention to confer ownership and the permanent transfer of rights is essential for a sale to actually occur or for a sale to be completed. So perhaps maybe for us in the legal practice, we can't consider using the right terminology in instances where there's a clear intention not to confer ownership and not to transfer the reversionary interest. We can look at perhaps using the right terminology. Say, for example, instead of talking about the sale price or the purchase price, just call it a lease premium, so that people are clear about what you're referring to. And a lease premium, just for purposes of context, it's normally a one-off payment. It's a one-off amount that is paid for the granting of a lease. That's essentially what a lease premium is. So, if you're not selling, don't call it a purchase price. Just call it a lease premium so that people know from the very beginning what the expectation is. And I guess the crux of what I am trying to communicate here is that we should not draft documents that inaccurately reflect the nature of the transaction. And I have a feeling that the joke I'm about to make may be a bit inappropriate, but I think it's good that we are all muted because I am sure there's someone within the audience who may have a burning rejoinder for that. But let me just challenge you to hold on to it and give it some thought, right? If you're not selling and the intention is just to grant a lease, why would the underlying contract that is sent to the counterparty be marked as an agreement to sell? If your intention is just to lease, why can't that underlying contract just be marked an agreement to lease? Then eventually you lease, and within the lease, we will have all those conditions that apply, including whether you want, there is going to be an automatic renewal and things like that. Okay, so lastly, you will note that on the face of it, now I'm looking at the exclusions up there. So you will note that on the face of it, there's a clear exclusion of land with shorter lease terms, because the 2020 Act explicitly states that it applies to, it only applies to land held on freehold title or on a leasehold title where the unexpired residue of the term is not less than 21 years. And also underline that there is an intention to confer ownership. So those are the ingredients, or that's the threshold. Now, according to me, when you look at the substance of this provision, it simply means that where you have an intention to confer ownership and your term appears to fall below the threshold, then you ideally just need to procure an extension of that term. Because again, the way things are structured right now, how else would you confer ownership of a multi-unit if you don't fall within these three exemptions that you can see on the slide, and you're below threshold? How else will you do it, the way things are structured right now? So think about it. Oops, sorry, let me just go back to the previous slide. I almost forgot something very important that I wanted to mention here. So more and more, we are encountering scenarios where the lease term remaining in relation to the project land is very close to the 21-year threshold. And I think I'm seeing this mostly in areas like Chiromo and Riverside, where when we get the parent title for a new transaction, you quickly notice that, we are at 23 years remaining, 22, 24. We are getting more and more of that. And then, as you know, off-plan developments can take a while. Some of these developments take 3 years, others take 4 years, right? So there is a likelihood of being below the threshold. That's a very important likelihood, because if it's going to take 3 or 4 years, it's possible that, and we are collecting the years. So if we start at 22 years remaining and we take 4 years, when you do the math, it's very possible that we will end up being below threshold at the point when the developer is actually processing the sectional titles, because you only process the sectional titles after the post-construction. So it seems that many people are missing that point. And whenever we try to inquire whether there's going to be an extension of lease, we don't get a positive response. But because I say this is a webinar which has an industry focus, maybe the challenge to us is that whenever you see a situation where you're dealing with a parent title, where the remainder of the term is very close to this threshold of 21 years, then please prompt the developer or the registered owner to start that process of extending the term. And COVID taught us a lesson, because COVID delayed so many developments. Some were even delayed for a period of 1 year, 1.5 years. So if you are very confident at the beginning that whatever happens, you will never go below threshold, you can't really predict what will happen. And it's always good to err on the side of caution. So as I said, in such a case, it is recommended that a developer takes proactive steps to extend the lease so that you're well above threshold when you're processing the sectional titles. And then if you're a buyer in this development, what I would recommend is that you need to ensure that the sale agreement includes provisions that address the potential extension of that lease term. Okay, so the next concept that I want to discuss is permitted use. Now, because of time, I think you can read what is on the slide later, but just note that the keyword here is densification, right? Sectional titles involve multi-unit developments. And I'm avoiding the use of multi-dwelling because, in my view, I've had a debate with a planner friend of mine, but I think globally when you say multi-dwelling, there's a larger emphasis on the dwelling. What is a dwelling? But, in our case, we apply the 2020 Act to townhouses, warehouses, offices, etc. So I'm trying to very deliberately refer to multi-unit developments. Now, because the sectional titles involve multi-unit developments, these are typically developments that require a higher density, right? So why this concept is relevant to understand is because you may be dealing with a situation where the original zoning may not accommodate such a high density, or you may also be converting from a single use or a low density plot or piece of land to a higher density. And I want you to relate back, to the initial example that I gave about this parent title in one of the leafy suburbs in Nairobi that has a main house, it has guest house, and then it also has servant quarters. The use may not actually permit that kind of densification. So you may want to have a conversation with your planner just to gauge whether a change of use is required. Now, the next concept I want to discuss is unit factor. And let me just say that this is another concept that has not been properly understood. But then I also want to say as a rider, that the surveyor, David, the government surveyor, will probably edify what I'm about to say because he has a better understanding of what unit factors are. Now, as I previously mentioned, a sectional unit rights extend from the internal area. So take your mind to an apartment within an apartment block to the external area. And this is because sectional units include their proportionate share in the common parts of that project land, right? So now, just to explain what unit factors are, they relate back to, when I was giving context of what used to predominantly apply. These unit factors are much like shares in a management company, because what they do is that they represent the unit owner's shares in relation to the common property. Now, other than the floor area, because that's one of the key factors that is applied to determine the unit factor, other than that, there could be other factors that determine how unit factors are allocated. I like to give the example of circumstances where similar units within a development may have different pricing. And how do I put it? There are some that normally technically sell panorama because they say the views are better on top, the higher you go. So you may find you have similar units within a development, but the unit on, say, the 10th floor, is highly priced because of the views and the panoramic advantage. So you may find situations like that. And because of that, or even just the fact that there's a unit within the same development that is in a premium location. And then another example that I like to give is a development that has studio apartments, and then it also has 1-bedroom apartments, it also has 2-bedroom apartments, and then it also has 3-bed apartments. I'm just giving this as an example. And then you find that how it's been designed, the studio doesn't have parking bays. So there are no parking bays that have been designated to the studio apartments. But the 1-bed, the 2-bed, and the 3-bed all have parking bays allocated to them, depending on, the number or the size or how they've decided to allocate the parking bays. So you will find that, and this allocation, I want to emphasize, is sort of like part of the sale. It's not a pool where everybody can access. I'm talking about a situation where those parking bays are constituted as part of the sale, right? So those are some of the nuances that can apply to determine how unit factors are allocated. But as I said, the government surveyor will give more insights. But what I wish to emphasize in relation to unit factors is that we must be very intentional in how we classify the parking bays, because this is another area of contention in the new matters that we are reviewing or engaging. You have to be very intentional in how you classify the parking bays, because it matters. It actually matters. Where there's a difference between where a unit is sold together with parking bays and where a unit is not sold together with parking bays. Where you're selling a unit together with parking bays, it means that the parking bays form part of the offering, right, during the sale, which means they would have an impact on the allocation of unit factors. So it matters, and you have to be very intentional about what you have decided in terms of classification of the parking bays. Now, having said that, we will actually, let me just go back to this slide. I think there's something I may have missed. Yeah, I think I covered it. So having said that, I want to now look at this next concept, which is exclusive use areas. So what I want to say is that it's possible to allocate portions of common property. And remember how we defined common property earlier. It's possible to allocate portions of this common property for the exclusive use of a specific unit owner. And then exclusive use can be designated through either a lease, and you can see here on the slide that what the provision under Section 40 of the 2020 Act. So it can be assigned through a lease. It can also be assigned through a license, or it can be assigned by noting it on the sectional plan. This is important. There seems to be an understanding that, and I want to say a limited understanding that what you're seeing under Section 40 is the only thing that applies. No. You could actually note exclusive use areas on the sectional plan. And now when we are interacting with the planner, with the surveyor later, you will see how that is done together with a sample, And I'm speaking so much about exclusive use areas. I just want to clarify now, take your mind again to an apartment block. An exclusive use area can be the hallways. It can be the parking bays. It can be a clubhouse where you have a clubhouse. And it can also be, gardens that adjoin a specific unit. For example, a corner house that has a very nice, beautiful garden that just adjoins that house, that can be designated as an exclusive use area. Now, this is why I emphasized earlier regarding parking bays, right? That the classification of parking bays at the conception of the development matters. Because if the parking bay, as I said, forms part of the offering in the sale, then it by all means must be designated for the exclusive use of that specific unit so that it doesn't fall in the larger pool. And I'm not saying that it now becomes a real right. No, it still forms part of the common area, but it is designated as an exclusive use area specific to a unit. So I just needed to emphasize that. Now, the other key concept I will look at is the sectional titles and freehold. Because of time, I just want to rush. There's a debate whether freehold titles are appropriate for sectional titles, given the shared nature of sectional title developments. And then there's also the creation of bylaws that the unit owners must abide to or adhere to. Now, what you're seeing on this slide reflects my view. Basically, that this is a hybrid, that what freehold sectional titles have done is essentially they've created a hybrid situation where the owners have a freehold right over the individual units, but also have to comply with the rules that govern the maintenance of the common property, right? And in my view, again, sectional titles still have the critical components of freehold, because there are two critical components of freehold. One of the components is immobility, and the second component is perpetual ownership. So they still have that critical component. And I want you to relate back to what I said, that sectional title ownership is three-pronged. So you have the ownership of the unit or the section, then you have the shared ownership of the common property, and then you have, the unit factors. So keep that in mind, even as we're debating the issue of sectional titles and freehold, or the place of freehold in sectional titles. Now, to my right, you will see a sample freehold sectional title, which was issued in April 2023. I hope it's clear enough. And here, just to settle the debate, because there's still quite a number of people who disagree that we have freehold sectional titles. This is one that has been issued in Kenya. Yes?
I apologize. We have 15 minutes left on the timer.
Oh, thank you for that reminder. Sorry, I got, let me try to rush. I'm running out of time. So I will skip this slide where I wanted to talk about, no, I won't skip this one because it's important. So I will skip this slide where I wanted to talk about Section 43 And I will also skip this slide where I wanted to talk about sectional titles and planned or mixed use developments. So let me just quickly touch on the multi-layered completion. And what I want to say about multi-layered completion, I believe, is important because as I alluded to earlier, georeferencing is carried out after construction is finished, right? And the reason for this is that drawings can actually show what a building is supposed to how a building is supposed to be put together. But as built, as you can see on the slide, shows how the building was really constructed or how it was delivered to the owner. So what I know is that experts say that sometimes a building may not come out quite as it was conceptualized or designed. So georeferencing is more like a final check, whether just to ensure that everything was delivered as it was represented. So, basically that. But the point I wanted to make is that given that georeferencing occurs after construction has been completed, it means that the units may be ready for occupation by the buyers before the title documents and all other company documents are processed. And because of that, it means that we have to see beyond the estimated construction completion date, because after that there will be post construction obligations, which now involve the surveyor coming in to georeference, then processing of the sectional title, and then now we arrive at the proper completion where we are exchanging or the developer is delivering the completion documents. So that let me say is the essence of some of the amendments that we make, because nowadays when we receive draft sale agreements, we have to layer that process. We have to say, okay, there's no point of buyers not taking occupation after construction has been completed and the certificate of occupation has been issued. However, because there are post-construction completion, then we have as parties to agree or to a fixed time frame within which now the developer has to get the georeferencing done, process the sectional titles, and then now deliver the completion documents. Yeah, so as I said, I will skip those two slides. And now I'm going to pass you over to the government surveyor for his expert insights. As I said, we have structured this segment around 5 questions, which are intended to unpack some of the aspects of sectional titles from a surveyor's perspective. So David, if you're ready, you can take the first question.
Okay, thank you, Lydia, for such a wonderful presentation. My name is David Ocheng for our visitors here. So maybe I can just shed some light on the technical aspect of sectional plans, preparations, and registration. So first and foremost, maybe I'd like to go through 2 terms that Lydia has really emphasized on. The first one being georeferencing. So georeferencing technically means, in simple language, just assigning coordinates to sectional units or plans such that you may be able to locate them in the real world. Okay. And then we also have the technical meaning of a sectional plan, which is essentially a georeferenced plan of units that is prepared as per the statutory body, which is the Survey of Kenya, which is responsible for determining and checking the quality of surveys done around the country. So quickly, let's go through the 5 questions that maybe Lydia has prepared for us. So question 1, we have maybe I can provide insight on how someone can check the integrity and the authenticity of sectional plans. So as we know, the Survey of Kenya is our statutory body in the country that is responsible for all surveys done, and all sectional plans that are prepared are usually deposited there and are available for the public. So if anyone is in need of a sectional plan, you just go to Survey of Kenya, you procure, and you'll be given certified copies. And all the plans that exist at the Survey of Kenya are authenticated by the Director of Service. Okay. Question 2. So, in time of timelines, how much time does it take to prepare sectional plans? So, let me just emphasize that the key elements in preparing sectional plans are usually georeferencing, which is the first and the most important aspect. Then we have the conveyancing bit, which comes after the georeferencing is done, and it's done usually by the land register. So in the first aspect of georeferencing, we usually have the data sourcing, which is essentially collecting all the data necessary on the development, which includes the building permits, the determining the cadastral plan on which the development sits on, and we also have the documents that the developer should provide the surveyor with, such like the copy of the title, the approved architectural drawings, and the approvals by the county government. So once the data is picked and sourced, now the surveyor goes to the ground and picks the data on all units, and this data usually helps the surveyor in compiling and plotting the sectional plans. So once the sectional plans are prepared, they're usually endorsed or signed by, and we have the owner. The owner has to sign that he gave the authority for the work to be done. Then the architect of the project also has to sign somewhere on the sectional plans that have been prepared. And of course, the surveyor too has somewhere where they sign. I wish Lydia, do you have an example of a sectional plan with the places where the key partners are supposed to sign?
I do, but I think I may be disorganized if I, stop sharing this.
Okay, it's okay. So yes, we have the architect, the owner, the surveyor, and lastly, you usually have the county government, because they usually send people to the ground to confirm whether the sectional plans that have been prepared by the surveyor are what exists on the ground. So all this usually forms the part of the compilation of the data that the surveyor has done. And then lastly, once the surveyor has compiled the data, it is usually presented to the Survey of Kenya, which is the statutory body responsible for surveys in Kenya. So at the Survey of Kenya now, this is where the quality check of the work that the surveyor has done is usually done. So once the file is presented to the Survey of Kenya, that is where what we call authentication is done, which is technically checking if the work done is quality and as per the laws provided. Then once all this is done, then we're done with the georeferencing part. The file is forwarded for conveyancing, where now the land registrar and the land admin come in, and this is where they usually do the registration of the sectional titles. So in terms of timeline, I think we should be speaking in a matter of months, not years. Probably give or take, I'd give it six months, depending on the scale of the development.
And that has happened, right?
Yes, it has happened. We've done for affordable housing, the president's project. So we usually do like 2,000 units in 6 months. So it's very possible.
Okay, great.
So on part,
I'm being reminded that we're running out of time, and I really wanted you to cover question 3, which is in relation to how do you allocate unit factors when preparing sectional plans.
So yeah, So unit factor is usually determined by the total area of the unit. Maybe, I don't know whether I shared a slide with an example of maybe you can just put on. Yeah, so from this slide, we can see that from the different columns, we have the unit area, which is the fourth column. Then we have the exclusive use area. So both the unit area, which is the floor area, plus the exclusive use area now gives us the total unit area of the units. And as Lydia said, there are cases where parking bays are assigned to houses and others they are not. But if they are assigned, please take note that parking bays form part of exclusive use area. So maybe, for example, I could take you on how the unit factor for the first unit was calculated. So we usually take the total unit area, which is 65.2. Then you divide it by the summation of the total unit areas, which is now 65.2 plus 65.2 all the way down. Then multiply what you get by 10,000. So that's how the unit factor is usually calculated. And now the unit factor usually have an effect on the voting rights and decision making of the tenants of the units with respect to the decisions made.
Okay.
Okay. So the common. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to read it out loud. What are the most common areas you encounter when developers submit sectional plans for approval, and how can these errors be avoided?
So, okay, I'll just mention a few examples. We have cases where the unit sizes that were sold to tenants or owners, once you go to georeference, you find like they're smaller or bigger than how they were sold or presented. So those are one of the challenges. So we usually encourage developers to just not estimate, but wait for the surveyor's input and the georeferencing to be done such that you can get the accurate size of the units. So that's one of the most common errors that we usually encounter. Secondly, we usually have cases where developments are done, but changes happen as the development is being done, such that you have the architectural plan, but you now have the final development on the ground. So in such cases where there was a change, maybe the house was meant to be 10 floors and another floor added, I'm sure the county government usually has a department where they approve the changes and the amendments on their architectural plans are done. So we usually encourage developers to, if there are any changes, they just make sure they have the right documentation such that when the file is presented at the Survey of Kenya, there's no difference in what is built and what is presented in the documents. Thirdly, I'd mention maybe incomplete projects. So we usually encourage developers to carry out sectional properties registration once all the development is done, because it's very difficult for a surveyor to come up with a sectional plan that doesn't exist or the development doesn't exist. So kindly encourage developers or your clients to make sure that the survey is done once all developments are done. Yeah. And fourthly, maybe I can just reiterate the point that you said about parking bays. Maybe the developers can come clear on how they want to allocate the parking bays. If they don't want to assign them to houses, maybe they just make it clear. And if they want to assign them to houses, they make it clear for the survey. Okay, thank you.
Question 5 is, What are the most common causes of delays in processing sectional titles, and how can developers mitigate these delays?
What I can say from this is the most common sources of delay. For example, we have the incomplete documentation. So we usually encourage developers, before any survey is done, just make sure your documentation is well in place. If you had to, as you were saying before, if the lease is almost expiring or a few years from expiring, just make sure you extend the lease so that you cannot have any hiccups or hurdles in processing your sectional titles. And also we encourage developers to always ensure and be able to provide the adequate administrative costs required for the registration of sectional titles, because in the process you find that there are some official fees that are very necessary to be paid both to the Survey of Kenya and the county government for the approvals. So we usually encourage developers to have to be ready to cater for the administrative costs. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know whether we can take a few questions or.
Yeah, I'm being informed that we've completely run out of time because it's 3 minutes past 11. So maybe just for you, I just want to check whether there's anything that you may have wanted to mention, which I didn't give you an opportunity to say. You could quickly just give an overview of that issue, and then we can wrap up.
Okay. Oh yeah, you had mentioned earlier about the surveys done for on vertical scale and horizontal scale, right?
Yes.
So maybe I can just make it clear that for sectional preparations for horizontal scale is usually more time consuming and more cost incurring for developments on horizontal scale more than vertical scale, because the work needed to pick data for horizontal scale is usually more than vertical scale. So yes, there's a bit of difference there in terms of costs and time, but the approval process of everything is just the same.
Okay. I think that question has come up so many times in the course of the transactions that I handle and also my professional colleagues. So thank you so much, David, again, for making the time. The insights, are invaluable, and we appreciate you making the time to just give us, your insights from an expert perspective. To the audience, I am informed that we are completely out of time. We wanted to answer a few of the questions that have been posted in the chat box, but please bear with us. Both David and I are available to engage you after this. Just feel free. You can reach out to either of us and we will be happy to engage or to answer some of the questions that you raised. But from us at CDH, we want to thank you again for making the time. And, please let us know if the webinar was insightful, was helpful, and if you, have any other topical issues that you would like us to cover. Thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you so much.